Well, in your outline today, you can see that we start out with a section, and I see you don't have yours, but let me grab one for you. Here you go. Here you go.
Oh,
there you are. Does everyone have a paper? Good. We start out with a section called Naomi Loses Herself. Can you remember the last time that you got lost? If you've ever been lost, it's a little harder to get lost if you can work your smartphone now. You know, you can at least find yourself geographically. It's fascinating. I was talking to one of our members who had given her husband a gift. It was one of these virtual reality systems, and you can type in a city location or a zip code or coordinates, and you can be taken to that location. So since they haven't been able to travel during the pandemic, they are traveling virtually. Isn't that quite amazing? They're going to cities all over the world. What a strange world we live in, right? Quite amazing. But in terms of who we are as people, it's quite possible to actually lose yourself, your sense of who you are. And we're going to be looking at chapters 3 and 4 today, continuing and finishing this story of Ruth. But to give a little context to these 3rd and 4th chapters, where the whole story is resolved, we want to look at this crisis that Naomi is in. So I'm going to just read to you these very compelling lines that come from chapter 1. So if you've got your Bibles, you can turn to chapter 1, or you can just listen for the word of the Lord. So you remember the disaster that Naomi faced. She lost her husband. She had 2 sons that were both married. They were living in a foreign territory, and the sons died. And so she made the decision to go back to Bethlehem, where she was from, and to kind of reconnect with her kin. And she told her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Oprah, not to come with her. And then, famously, Ruth decides to go with her. When they arrive at Bethlehem, there are these haunting lines from chapter 1. This is a reunion moment, and quite wonderfully, the people of Bethlehem respond in a beautiful way as a community. They see Naomi coming in, and they greet her in this unreserved, beautiful. Have you ever come home after a long time away? I've been telling some of the folks here that we're going to England on the 19th, arriving on the 20th. Well, we haven't seen a lot of those relatives. I haven't seen them for 4 years. Julie hasn't seen them for almost 3 years now. And so, we're picturing that kind of moment when we arrive. Naomi had that moment. Here it is. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. Isn't that beautiful? And the women leading the charge said, "It's Naomi. Look, this is Naomi. It's Naomi." And this is how Naomi replies. "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So it's interesting. Emotionally, what a scene. The people are excited to see her, and boy, does she hold them off. And so I would describe this as what we would call a loss of self. So emotionally, she's lost herself. We can lose ourselves emotionally. We can kind of become strangers to our own selves in the sense that most of us have an emotional pattern, a kind of equilibrium. And when that shifts dramatically, we kind of feel like we're strangers to ourselves. Well, the word Naomi means pleasant. It means someone who's, kind, and that person that's ready to smile at you and enjoys life and so on. And the implication of the story is that was Naomi's personality, not just her name. But she now says, all I feel emotionally is bitterness. So she's a stranger to herself emotionally. Relationally, she's also lost herself because she was defining her life in terms of the roles that she had as a wife and as a mother, and suddenly the roles are taken away from her. her primary relationships, the focus of her prayer life, her attention, her time, her hopes and her dreams, bang, all pulled away. So she kind of loses herself emotionally as well. And then I've put in our outline, she lost herself theologically, right? Because she publicly blamed, it's God's fault. These disasters are God's fault. In effect, it's sort of one step beyond lament toward blaming. She kind of loses her faith, her sense of God's purpose in her life. And then psychologically, also, she says to the two daughters, in effect, you don't want to go anywhere with me because I've got nothing left to live for. Not only am I bitter in the present moment and sort of bereft, relationally, but I don't see a future for myself. That's psychologically losing yourself because you don't have any sense of purpose that's connecting this moment to a future moment. There's no point living. So I'm starting this way because this is the background for who Ruth is. This explains a lot about the character of Ruth's commitment. But before we get there, I thought I would just mention, I think we often think, when you think of someone who's discovering their identity or pondering their identity, we tend to think of someone who's, sitting alone, thinking about themselves, right? The expression we have in English is navel gazing, right? That's how we think, we're going to discover our identity. We have, all ideas about identity are culturally driven. And this becomes evident when you compare the way cultures understand identity. This became, I think I mentioned in an earlier time that I had to teach a course in medical ethics a few months ago. And it involved a subject I had never studied. And not that I hadn't thought about some of these medical quandaries, but I had never actually studied the literature, the books that were involved in the articles and so on. So I had to kind of, as they say, knock all of that up. I had to read all these books and articles. This was a field that started in the 60s, and it started because in American hospitals and in care facilities, there were new problems that had to do with technology. Some of them had to do with the extension of life, some of them had to do with the termination of life at the beginning. And there were new technologies involved with all this, so there were new questions. And that's when the field of medical ethics began. I don't know if you knew that. There was no field of medical ethics, no academic chairs, no studying of this in universities until the 1960s. So I got to read this from the very first books on to now. And it was fascinating to read these first books because since these were public hospital settings where these questions were coming up, they were looking for a way to talk about them that everyone could agree on. Sort of a universal vocabulary, universal ethical standards, that no matter which religion you were from or which background, America's a diverse society, you could all agree on these would be our medical standards. And you know what they came up with for their definition of identity? And they thought of this as a universal idea. Identity is primarily about autonomy, independence. It's about your capacity to live apart from and independently of other people. That was the very first principle that they tried to make a universal principle. And so they thought that was a necessary truth, what we call a necessary truth of reason, that any reasonable person thinking about what it meant to be a human being would automatically start with autonomy. Now, it's interesting, as the field went on, do you know what kind of problems emerged with that as your first criteria? Well, think about children. They're not autonomous. So guess what? They're not people. So Peter Singer at Princeton University, who's the chair of he's one of the most famous medical ethicists in the world, he says, up to a certain age, you can just kill children. You can just kill children, imagine. But how do you get into it? Same thing with people that have special needs. They're not autonomous individually. They can't be independent. So they're not truly people. I mean, I was shocked to read this. Highly intelligent people coming up with these barbarous conclusions because they started with the wrong picture of human identity. Now, human identity is partly individual. So I want you to talk to your groups as you gather and think about this yourself. When you come to understand your own identity, do you define it by your individual characteristics? In other words, the things that make you different from other people. that are sort of uniquely things about you. When you think about yourself, is that how you define yourself? That is the dominant image in Western culture. We are the culture of autonomous individuals. That's how we think about a lot of things in our culture. But that's a very culturally relative idea. So in other cultures, and the one we're studying would be one of those, all the ancient Near Eastern cultures, people understand their individual identity relationally. When you ask them who they are as individuals, they talk about their relationship with their parents, their children, their communities, the roles that they play, how they serve and connect with other people. Is this making sense? And so these are two fundamentally different ways to define your identity. Now, I think there's a middle, being Presbyterian, there's a middle course, we're people of the middle way, because there are things uniquely individual about each of us, right? There's nothing wrong with seeing uniqueness and particularity, but at the same time, defining yourself relationally. Let's come back to the medical ethics example. How many of you have ever known somebody who was mentally challenged and not autonomous, who was extremely loving? Have you ever known? I've known people who dramatically impacted their families and their communities who could never be autonomous. I ask parents when they've had a child, how has this changed your life? And sometimes they just break down and cry. I discovered new places in my heart. I didn't realize I could nurture. All these things come out. And it's like, oh, that baby had that impact, that non-autonomous, totally dependent baby, right? So, even pets can love, and not all of those are autonomous, right? So there's all these different issues that come around definition of identity. And this really does come into play in our story because Naomi, to come back to Naomi, has lost herself. And one of the central biblical ideas is that in order to be who we're meant to be, we have to have an experience of unconditional love. So rather than our lives being these individual projects that we're kind of working out independently of others, we actually need to be unconditionally loved and accepted. We need people who can make commitments to us that are no matter what commitments, where we're accepted and nurtured and encouraged. That's what marriage is about. That's what parenting is about. That's ideally what Christian community and church is about. And that is the ground in which we grow. That's the best ground to become your most individual self. And so Ruth is capable of this love, this word hesed that keeps coming up in our studies, this unconditional loyal love. And it is the instrument by which Naomi recovers her identity in this story. This is really an identity story. So let's just take a little bit of a look at that. This section C is called Saving Naomi. And of course, Ruth announces her unconditional commitment to Naomi in chapter 1. Don't press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people should be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. She actually invokes a curse upon herself. May the Lord do this thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. That sounds pretty unconditional to me. Now, what impact does this unconditional love have on Naomi? This is just amazing. In chapter 2, we see verses 1 and 2 that Ruth decides when they get to Bethlehem that she is going to go to work. I had some jokes on Sunday about work. You remember? I have some jokes about unemployment as well, but none of them work. So I'm not going to share any of those. But Ruth decides that she is going to go to work and she's going to glean. How many of you know what gleaning is in an agricultural setting? These days, my cousins in Canada that are farmers, they are on big threshing machines. Have you ever seen these threshing machines? You got to climb up a ladder. It's like 15 feet in the air to get into the cab. And they have these giant wheel, and there's this cloud of bits that come out like this, out from it. And it's it's threshing all this grain and just moving along through the fields. It's really quite amazing. But of course, at this time, everything was done by hand. So you had people who were pickers, in effect, picking this grain. And then behind them, you had a second group that were the poor of the land, the people of the land. And by biblical mandate, they had the right to be able to glean in parts of these fields so that they wouldn't starve. And so Ruth goes to glean. She goes out to glean in these fields. So she's practically committed to Naomi's survival. It's not just words. She's going to work to feed Naomi. It's a sign of commitment, right? When you're going to help someone survive. That's the first way she shows her hesed love. Then theologically, it's interesting. Ruth the Moabite has confidence in God. And this begins to rub off on her mother-in-law. When she comes back and tells Naomi about the first day of work, she's been blessed at the first day of work, and she's met Boaz, and Boaz, we're going to get to him in a minute, but he's cared for her, and so it's a very successful first day of work, and she reports this, and immediately Naomi says, "Blessed be he, Boaz, by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Just a few verses before, she was, God has cursed me and my life is up, Now here she's blessing God. It's interesting, isn't it? So she's recovering herself theologically, her faith. Relationally, in 2:22, she is now beginning to act to help Ruth. She's beginning to advise Ruth. She's beginning to see that she can make a relational difference for Ruth. She's beginning to invest. And it's becoming a two-way relationship. She's recovering herself relationally. And then psychologically, at the beginning of chapter 3, she says to Ruth, this is Naomi, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you." She's now taking the lead in providing a future for the two of them, right? She has really recovered quite significantly. And that's the power of this special committed love that we can exercise in our relationships. And if you think back on your own life, the people who showed you that kind of love, parents and teachers, whoever it was in your life, friends, those are critical people who make all the difference for us. So it's a redemptive kind of love that she's showing. Now, one wonderful things about this story is Boaz is also a pretty great guy, isn't he? He's a wonderful man. And Boaz shows us something else in the Bible, which is, and the two things are connected, identity and sight. Sometimes identity, the way we understand ourselves, can limit our capacity to see other people. And, the most famous example of that in sociology is where we're in a group that is so tight and defensive about its identity that everyone outside the group is automatically seen as the other or the stranger. And some groups function that way. They function over against. The classic example is gangs, right? Where, we have this in a lot of our inner cities where people brand themselves with tattoos. They go through ritualistic rites of joining, oftentimes assaulting or killing someone to get into the gang. And they take oaths of loyalty to one another, like sacrificial oaths. But those identities are over against all the other gangs. And they will protect their turf with their life. And so all these shootings that are taking place in inner cities in America, like most of those are turf wars, where these are drive-by shootings. People are on each other's turf. So our identity and how we see others is an interesting question to talk about with ourselves. And it's fascinating that Boaz is, he's this Israelite guy, and Ruth is clearly a foreigner. It's wherever she comes up, it's Ruth the Moabite. How many of you know a little bit about Moab? Do you know anything about Moab? Well, Moab, Ruth the Moabite sounds like, it's not quite like saying, Boaz from Bethlehem. It's got a little bit of a bite to it because the Moabites, it was an insult. If you look in Genesis 30 to 38, you see these chapters that have to do with an incestuous relationship that Lot had with his daughters. This is after the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so the Moabites trace their lineage back to that incestuous encounter. So there are people whose history is marked in a certain way to the Israelites. They're not only pagans, they're the sort of bottom level you can be in. The idea that she's a Moabite should make you suspicious of her right away. And yet, wonderfully, in the story, if you look at chapter 2, verses 8 through 13, we have this first encounter between Ruth and Boaz. And Boaz is inquiring. He asks one of the other folks who's one of his pickers, the person who's in charge of them, he says, now, how is she connected in? This is a new person. How is she connected in? And right away, the person identifies her racially. She's that Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And he says, she asked me if she could glean. And then he says, she's been the hardest worker of anyone in the company throughout the day. Interesting. And he immediately begins to extend grace to her. He says, don't feel like you have to move anywhere else. You can glean on my property. And I'm going to speak to the young men to make sure they don't bother you. I'm going to extend my protection to you. And I want to make sure you've got adequate water and drink and so on. And she asks why he's found favor. And this shows how he's seen her. He says this, all you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, how you left your father and mother and your native lands and came to a people you didn't know. He sees her hesed. He sees her covenant loyalty. He sees her sacrifice. He sees her courage. He can see past her racial identity to see her character. And he can admire it, even with the differences that are separating them, gender differences, religious differences, cultural differences, and status differences. He is able to admire who she is as a person. May the Lord, and he blesses her in their first encounter, may the Lord reward you for your deeds. May you have a full reward. May the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge, do this for you. That's quite an extraordinary thing. And it raises the issue for us of how we see others. Do we have that capacity to look past all these categories? There's a lot of categorization that goes on in the world. Some of it deliberate, because the categories have advantages for people and for groups. And to some degree, there's advantages sometimes in setting ourselves over against others. We can dismiss our obligations to a group if they're over here, not connected to us, and so on. But this story is partly about overcoming that. So there's also a theme that I love in this, which is the theme of providence and human action. So we think sometimes of one of the summaries of who God is the one who does the great acts. The Magnalia Dei is what Calvin calls them, the great deeds of God. And you see references in the Psalms to the great deeds of God. And when you're summarizing the faith, it tends to be those highlight moments. He was the one who destroyed the Egyptians at the Red Sea. He was the one who made the mountain smoke and gave the commandments to Moses. It's the highlight reel moments, right? Kind of the top 10 great acts of God. That's how often we think of the faith. But there's this other quieter way that God works in concert with us. And it has to do with our first theme, which is when we're willing to join him, to trust in him, and when we're willing to begin to exercise the power of this loyal love, this Hesed love, it creates opportunities for him to bless and change the circumstances around us. This is kind of the everyday providential action of God. And this is the same is true in the story of of a church community. It's interesting. I had a meeting this week on Monday with this leadership team from Grand Canyon University. And I have completely misunderstood what was going on at Grand Canyon. I just, it was a little beyond my imagination, frankly. Out east, a Christian college is usually about 11 or 1,200 students, and there's a certain conventional picture that comes up in your mind with Christian college, Christian university. And I just didn't get what God was doing over there. And plus, it felt a long way away. Does anyone feel sometimes like the West Valley is a long way away? I mean, basically, it's almost as far as from where I was living before in downtown Philadelphia or downtown Manhattan. It just felt almost like a different region. So for that reason, we at the church have concentrated more on trying to get relationships with ASU. And that has proven very difficult. And I love ASU. There's a lot of wonderful things. It's a dynamic place. It's changing Tempe. It's tremendously impactful for the state. But, for instance, we couldn't get their gospel choir to come and sing here. We invited them 5 years in a row. And finally they said to us, we don't really like to sing at churches. I said, oh, you're a gospel choir. You don't like to sing at churches. What's that about? Well, there's a certain attitude about churches. So God has been showing me in a variety of ways, showing us as a community that we need to look a little bit west here and connect with GCU. And by contrast, we met how many of you went to the GCU concert, GCU Christmas concert? Juan de Deos Hernandez is their director. Don't you love that? John, the man of God, Hernandez. And his wife was in the Phoenix Orchestra, Heidi. She was the harpist that we had. You remember from the broadcasts? We had her in the pandemic period. We got to know her, and through her we got to know him. Well, we sent him an email. He came within a week to see the place. And within a month, they were already coming to a Christmas concert. And they're doing 2 dates in the spring. Bang, responsive like that. And because our missions align. And anyway, I had this meeting with the president and the academic dean from the College of Theology and the man who's in charge of the dean of students and the campus ministries. And they told this story of how they had been convicted that they needed to become responsible for the poverty in the West Valley. They were a struggling school. They had 900 students. And Mike Vreeland actually can testify to this because he was there when they had 900 students. And they were in this decaying neighborhood, and they were $20 million in debt when the current president, Brian Mueller, came. And he's kind of a genius fundraiser. So in tandem with Jerry Colangelo, they raised $1.5 billion. They went, imagine that on your balance sheet. They went from $20 million in debt to $1.5 billion. And their board said to them, we should move, right? We should go somewhere. We could go to Orange County. We could go to Pasadena. We've got enough resources. We could buy things, any great place we want to live, at least Scottsdale. And as they prayed about it, they realized God wanted them instead to invest in the urban problems in all of these neighborhoods. And that was the key, that commitment to Hesed love, to love these children in the neighborhood that were, and think about this isn't their mission, you would think their number one priority, right? It's educating kids 18 to 22. That's the main thing. But along with that, they made this Hesed commitment to all these children that are struggling right out through Maryville. So they started a tutoring program. They now have 1,200 kids in the tutoring program. And they were coming to talk to us about, what's next for them. They are thinking of creating a program which would be for thousands. Right now they have kids from 100 schools that are being mentored individually, but it's only an hour or 2 a week. They're thinking of creating a program that would go from 3 in the afternoon till 8, like our Mentor Kids program, that would involve thousands of kids. And they've already raised the money for the scholarships. There's a whole lot. They've got the athletic teams to do the sports. They've got the nursing system to do medical care for these families. I mean, they're just envisioning. They've created a space for this with 100,000 square feet. I mean, it's just, it's amazing. But that started with this just little commitment. The president started a tutoring program. He managed to convince 20 kids to get involved. You know, you have to act first, trusting and demonstrating this love, and then it opens ways that God can then create a much more wonderful situation. Ruth acts in the story, and she takes an initiative with working. She takes an initiative speaking to Boaz. She engages with him. She asks him questions in the story. Why are you being so kind to me? And thank you. You know, she thanks him. And so she's establishing a relationship. And then at the beginning of chapter 3, Naomi now has recovered herself and woken up. And she gives a sort of, what did I call it here? It's really a introduction to seduction, I think, a little bit. It's a little bit ambiguous what it means to uncover the feet. But certainly Ruth puts on her best stuff, you know, and a little perfume, and goes to the threshing area, and really I see this as a moment where she says, despite the difference in their ages, that she would love him to be the next of kin. And if you read the chapter, you understand what that means. You remember Levirate marriage, where the brothers would all have a responsibility. If one brother died, then the next brother would have to marry the wife. And the reason for that was so that she could have children for the brother in the brother's name. His name would not die out, kind of an immortality. Well, this is similar. The next of kin has an obligation to bless the dead relative, in this case, you know, Ruth's husband, by being willing to marry. And she's saying, in effect, I'm up for it if you're up for it. And he sees this again as Hesed love, because she's not only caring for Naomi and working to support Naomi and giving her the emotional strength and courage and faith to carry on in her life, but she's still meeting the obligation she originally had to the dead husband. And he is just blown out by her incredible attitude, the quality of her faith. And so he agrees to do it. And that takes us to the bargain at the gate. When you see this word gate in the Bible, it's not just a doorway. That's a way of saying the place where things are settled. It's like we would say the courtroom. They didn't have a court system. And so the elders, the people of standing in the community, the men of standing in the community would go to settle issues there. When, you know, in the story of Mary and Joseph, when Joseph is described as a man, it's translated different ways, but, you know, a man of good standing or a man of repute, that means in his village, he's an elder at the gate. He's one of the people that gets consulted when decisions are made. So they go to this location at the gate, and Boaz engages because he's a near kin, but he's not next of kin. He's not the actual immediate one. And there's this little bargaining thing that comes along here, and the next of kin, Boaz sort of shows him that he can acquire this piece of land if he wants. And land, of course, very valuable in Israel. You know, there's just a little bit of arable land like this that goes down the middle, and there's things that can't be farmed on either side. So land is always valuable, and a chance to acquire it is a good thing. But, of course, it means you're going to be responsible for Ruth, and she's young, and you're probably going to have children. And now you're going to be responsible for the children. You see the economic costs coming in here, and also he's already got his own kids, and how will this affect their inheritance? And so he backs out and makes room for Boaz. Boaz sort of strategically negotiates with him. We're going to conclude today by looking at chapter 4, verses 11 and 12 and 17. And this is just, to me, a remarkable thing to come to our theme of how we see others. Boaz has seen Ruth, who she is, but it's not only Boaz. Maybe it's partly because of him. But the community there in Bethlehem, when they realize that Boaz is going to play this role, they say this: all the people who are at the gate and the elders say, we are witnesses, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house," that's Ruth, "like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel." This is saying, may Ruth the Moabite become like a matriarch of Israel. Can you believe it? This again is the power of genuine power of Hesed love. Not only has Ruth overcome her own difficult situation and Naomi's situation and restarted her life, but she's changed the way this whole village of Israelites thinks, the way they see the world. Not only are they letting her live in the village and be part of the community, they are giving her a blessing like you could only reserve for an Israelite. May she become like the matriarchs of our nation. And then lo and behold, within the providence of God, she becomes something greater than the original matriarchs of Israel. Because as we see in the genealogy, the descendants, she does have a son, Obed, and they named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David, the greatest king in the history of Israel, and the great foreparent of Jesus, the genealogy of Jesus. Quite remarkable. So, have some fun today talking about identity. Identity is a tricky matter. You know what they call the identity of a person who is secretly a priest? They call that identity. It's an alter ego. It's going to be fun to talk a little bit of identity, about how you see the world today. So let's see if there are any questions today. Any questions or comments? Good. Yes. That's this role of the next of kin. So every clan would have like a lead, every sort of substantial family unit would have a lead person. And let's say that you were the lead person and I got into debt and I'm part of your clan. You would be the person who would go around to all the relatives and raise enough money to get me out of debt, out of jail. You would redeem me from my situation. And so akin to that is this situation, in a sense, the husband who's died, his name is being redeemed because Boaz is coming in and creating a new family, and Obed becomes a child in the other person's name. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's someone who can make up for things, and who can redress imbalances and who can fix problems. Yeah. Good. Any other questions? Let's take a moment, we'll pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for our four parents and these amazing women and their courage and the way they understand the example they give us of being able to act within our daily circumstances, even when we're in very difficult circumstances, to act trusting that if we show your loyal love to others, you will open doors and change possibilities for us. And we pray your blessing on all those who are showing loyal love, particularly to those who need it the most in our city and in our world. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.